But one of the things that I would like to highlight at the start, and this is data from the project, is that the Muslim students I've come across who do academic Islamic studies in higher education institutions which are not Islamic find the experience, not all of them, but some of them find the experience transformative. And in the words of one of those students, who's a male Muslim student, he says, personally speaking, when I was in the first year, I did an Islamic history course as an elective. So he was doing a different kind of degree. And that helped me a lot. Even as a Muslim, I learned a lot about the religion that I thought I would know, but I didn't know. So if you're interested in learning a great thing about this university, he was talking about his own university somewhere in the north. I've mentioned this before. Do or go to the Islamic Studies department, and I definitely recommend that you do a course there. So, I mean, I've probed this with him and with some of my students over the years, and this term I teach an intensive course on religion and gender in Hinduism and Islam, co-taught with my colleague Professor Ram Prasad, a distinguished professor in Hindu thought. And we discovered a lot of parallels between Hinduism and Islam, believe it or not. But one of the things that I've heard from my Muslim students on the course, when we were looking at how Sharia deals with gender identity, especially the different categories, is that they were completely flabbergasted to know there's something more than male and female in Sharia. And to read the history about how gender identity has been dealt with in Muslim society, historically speaking, as well as legally speaking within the Sharia paradigm. And I come across this quite a lot when just talking about my research as an academic on questions of prophethood in Islamic theology or Quranic studies or tafsir, that Muslims, young and old, come and tell me we've never known this question was even broached within the Islamic tradition. So one of the things that I'm more and more convinced of is that we do need a different type of Islamic studies that transcends both the reductive functional approach that we have in our seminaries, as well as the more, let's say, Orientalist approach, or more historically focused approach that we find in some institutions or some centers of Islamic studies, which have no concern for the contemporary implications of Islamic studies research. And I come at this from the perspective of post-colonial theory, especially the work of Saba Mahmood, in which she takes the stance that there's no knowledge that is just for knowledge's sake. Every knowledge we produce will reconstitute the subject of our inquiry. So if we're talking about the Islamic tradition, if we're producing knowledge about the history of Islam, societies, Muslim societies today, that knowledge is going to impact Muslims as well as others. So Islamic studies, academic Islamic studies, need to think about these questions and go beyond the old debate of whether one does Islamic studies from an insider perspective or an outsider perspective. I have a few remarks. I didn't intend to give you an introduction reflective of my experience. I had a few things written here which I'll read out, or read some of them out anyway. So for the last 100 years, in the Muslim world, we've been discussing the question of reform. And central to that question has been the idea of reforming the study of Islam. One of the tropes has been shifting or reopening the gate of ijtihad, or shifting the focus, or reshifting the focus to back to rationalism and to a rational approach. This has, in a way, has had implications for how we deal with the Islamic tradition. We deal with it as if it were, or at a certain point or after a certain point, it has become irrational. and that we need to revive it back, to bring it back to its golden age. I'm not going to contest these representations, but I'd like to say that one of the things that we've been discussing in reforming Islamic education is the introduction of spaces for women to learn more about Islam. And very recently, actually, the University of Al-Azhar has created a unit which requires women muftis. So Al-Azhar, especially in the 18th and the 19th century, became only a male-only institution. It wasn't like that before the 19th and the 18th and the 19th century. So there were the circles of knowledge were open to women. But from the 18th century onwards, it became a male-only institution. And in 1964, it opened its gates to women by establishing a women's faculty. But as some of you who have gone through the seminaries, the women faculty is largely gendered, in the sense that the curriculum is different, the expectations are lower, the women students have less access to circles of religious knowledge at a higher level. And but recently, actually, Al-Azhar has been pushing for including women in the religious establishment, not yet at the highest level of the Council of Ulama, but certainly within the role of muftis. These women, or this kind of fatwa unit, might sound progressive, new, a step forward, but it's actually something that is within the realm or within the boundaries of the tradition. A key dimension, however, of the vision is that women muftis will not just transmit pre-packaged fatwas, and that's what I find interesting. But they will take into consideration something called fiqhul waqa, the jurisprudence of reality. The jurisprudence of reality takes into consideration, when giving an answer, the specific circumstances of the questioner. So you may give an answer to a person saying what you've asked about is permissible, to another person it won't be permissible because of particular circumstances. An interesting vision, as I said, of the role of muftiya, the woman mufti or the female mufti, beyond traditional justifications of having access to women muftis, we remove the embarrassment regarding certain questions about purity, menstruation, etc. They are available for everyone. And the idea here is that they are more capable of investigating the gendered experiences and background circumstances, because a lot of the questions are about family issues, not just purity issues, divorce, sexual relations, custody of children. And this is not just specific to women. So the gendered experience here is both pertinent to both men and women, and men also need to hear the female point of view, or the point of view of the female mufti. So they are available for everyone who calls them. And maybe we're still a few steps behind them joining the highest council of ulama in Egypt, but I'm hoping that this will happen in the next few years. We know, of course, that Islamic theology imposes no constraints on women participating in knowledge and education. And I often cite this quotation because I don't think members of the Muslim communities I meet actually realize how important and fundamental that is in the Islamic tradition. I come across other non-Western traditions and Western traditions where women's role in the production of knowledge in religious leadership is far more contested and difficult to establish, whereas we have this open space that hasn't been utilized yet in the Islamic tradition when it comes to women's, or the idea about women's role and potential contribution to thinking about jurisprudence and other matters of theology. So a mainstream, you can even call him conservative, Shafi'i scholar from the medieval period called An-Nawawi, author of the 40 Nawawiyya or 40 Hadith Nawawis, actually summarizes the conception in Sunni Muslim tradition for women's role in the production of religious knowledge or in Islamic studies within Muslim context. He says that a mufti or a mujtahid, actually, someone who exercises independent reasoning, must be a responsible adult Muslim, trustworthy, pure of corruption, moral faults, who possesses a perceptive mind, sound intellect, capable of coherent thought, and who's exact in action, accurate in reasoning, and generally attentive. I mean, we're not going to discuss, the difficulties in achieving this ideal. But the point is, it doesn't matter, according to An-Nawawi, and I'm quoting him, whether the mufti is a free person, a slave, a woman, or a blind person. The mufti could even be a mute person if he or she, and I've put in she here because I think the text accepts it, can write or make gestures understandable to others. So the point here is that at the highest level of knowledge production within the Islamic knowledge system, there is no impediment for women being included, not just as muftis transmitting what the great ulama say, but according to An-Nawawi, this is actually the ideal for a mujtahid mutlaq, and that means absolute ijtihad. So theoretically speaking, and that might come as a shock, women could establish their own madhab according to this within the Sunni tradition. I'm not calling for that, but I'm just pointing it out. Classical Muslim thinkers, I keep saying at different contexts, so no impediment to women issuing religious rulings, commenting on theology, and as I just said, potentially establishing their religious schools. So we don't find a condition saying, well, a woman can be mufti but never a mujtahid. Although these themes, by the way, are returning to Muslim discourses about whether women can be mujtahids or not. So at the theoretical level, at the theological level, there are no impediments. But at the institutional levels, at the structures, the historical structures of Muslim knowledge, we don't see women playing the role that the theology seems to open up for them. Although, in fact, if you go and read the early traditions about the revelations of the Quran, Asbab al-Nuzul literature, we find women playing an interesting role in being midwives for the Quran, if I may use that term, or occasioning revelations. And in occasioning these revelations, the kinds of questions they asked and the expectations of the text actually reflect a deep understanding of the principles on which the text is based, expecting justice of the text in the case of the woman disputant who disputes with the Prophet regarding her divorce, thinking that the Quran, as it's revealed, is actually still not answering her question. I mean, I'm writing a paper on this, but it's very interesting to see a poor, middle-aged woman disputing with the Prophet and refusing to settle for whatever the revelation is giving her in terms of leeway until she finds her answer. That is not just an active agency in responding to, it is actually an active agency in constituting the revelatory experience and text, and reflects, as I said, an understanding of what the Quran is actually all about. So the women were interpreting the revelatory experience in general terms, even at the time of the Prophet, asking questions and waiting for specific answers. So women were not just transmitters of hadith, with all due respect to al-muhaddithat as an endeavor to reclaim the role of Muslim women in history. But the idea for me is that Muslim women's contribution to Islamic studies, and I don't know how much time do I have.
I'll give you a few more minutes.
Yeah. So with respect to the role of jurisprudence, with respect to the role of the religious disciplines in general, I think a gendered academic Islamic studies could offer greater opportunities of not just trying to reclaim the history of women and the role in religious knowledge, or carve out a new role for women in Islamic studies or in the study of Islam and the production of Muslim knowledge in general, I think there is an opportunity, especially if Islamic studies is enriched with, let's say, cross-intellectual traditions, including Western philosophy, not just feminist philosophy, but Western philosophy at large. I'm personally interested in hermeneutics, and I'm not going to explain that now, but the history of Western thought in general, I think Muslim women and thinking about gender within the context of Islamic studies could not just only help us understand the history of Islam, but also understand the contact between Islam and Western thought, and to reclaim, as one philosopher I sometimes read called Jacques Derrida, to reclaim the lost brother or lost sibling of the Abrahamic tradition and the actually Islamic substratum of Western thought. So there is so much that we could give back. We shouldn't be intellectually reliant on Western strands of thought as Muslim women, whether it's feminist, whether it's liberal, liberal philosophical trajectories. I think we could be far more reconstructive and contribute to Western thought through the Islamic, through positive, constructive engagement in the Islamic tradition. I know that I've talked in a lot of theoretical terms, but to simplify things, if we're going to have an agenda for a gendered Islamic studies, I would strongly say that it should be an academic agenda. It's not just about learning the text and learning to transmit certain types of text or explain jurisprudential issues. This is a reductive approach because, again, as some of you may have heard me say before, Islamic studies in the pre-modern times, without valorizing the past, was always at the vanguard of knowledge within the times. People like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina and many others, regardless of where they stood on questions of law and ethics and philosophy, they were actually the top experts in the various fields they engage with, whether it's logic, falsafa, whatever. Compared to that, Islamic studies today has been reduced to its most, let's say, basic form and function. And I think women who are intellectually engaged with Islamic studies should do more than just focus on the sociology of Islam. We do have a serious male-focused or male-oriented Islamic studies, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim. So there is a lot of opportunity and there is space for Muslim women actually to engage and gender Islamic studies in the different kinds of institutions that do Islamic studies. An agenda for research, my wish list, to say it in other terms, we have to move beyond just focusing on what the Quran says, because whether we like it or not, the Quran is symbolically central, but Islamic civilization and Islamic thought is built on a lot of other things other than the Quran, and we do need to engage beyond the Quran. I think kalam or theology is very important, and I am personally working on prophetology and prophecy and the gendered constructions of prophetology and prophecy in the Islamic tradition. Women in the seerah, we keep talking about women in the Quran, but what about women in the seerah, the formative history of Islam, the role of women in the production of knowledge, but also in the production of norms and historical and societal structures. These are all important aspects that we seem to be ignoring, and we're often actually attracted to the politicized topics like let's all work on the wife beating verse. Let's all, work on rape and sexuality issues within the marital paradigm. I would say let's work on purity, let's work on ritual, let's work on the meaning of salah. And again, I'm invoking Saba Mahmood. I think there are a lot of trajectories and agendas that need to be approached, and we're often thinking through a narrow lens. Thank you.